In the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara and in physics and science, duality is no longer looked at as a conflict of sorts. It's not looked at as a play of opposites, and it should not be, right? Because in physics, for instance, you have something called as complementarity, in which the idea is that there are certain kinds of variables, right, which do not have simultaneous certainty up to the ultimate point, right? So if you're talking about position and momentum, right, energy and time, right, these two, when they are simultaneously measured, the precision with which they can be measured is constrained. They cannot be done simultaneously, right? So now you may ask, which is the correct way to characterize a system, right? Is it one or the other, right? The answer is that both, essentially, right? The answer is that both of these complementary aspects have to be brought together to give us a comprehensive overview of what the system actually is, right? So if you say that, you know, there is a duality and there is a fuzziness, right, of separates of different distinct variables, that is not the answer that will describe nature in its entirety, right? Now, even for instance, our eyes, right, the way our eyes work, there's a left and the right eye, right? And it's a wonder of nature, right? The way they coordinate with respect to each other. So for instance, in technical terms, if you would talk about the slight disparity, right, between the retinal images of each eye, which is called as binocular disparity, that is integrated by the visual cortex to compute what is known as the stereoscopic depth, right? So when that is integrated in a specific way, then it goes beyond what a monocular or one eye could have described that same object as, essentially, right? So again, complementarity comes into the picture. Now in Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we have had this concept of Dvandvatita, which basically means beyond opposites, right? In Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, for instance, we have Shiv Shakti. We have these opposing ideas, I wouldn't say, because, you know, they are never quite opposing ideas in that sense, right? People later on, even today's age, we talk about these poles or these different elements or, you know, aspects, but that is not how it was described. That is not how we should be looking at it. So in a different context, in the Saundarya Lahiri, for instance, we find a very beautiful shlok with which Saundarya Lahiri is begun. That's the shlok, the first shlok of Saundarya Lahiri, where it says, Shiva Shaktya yukto yadi bhavati shaktaha prabhavitum na chedevim devo na khalu kushalaha spanditum api atah tvam aradhyam harihara virinchadhibhiri api prananturum stotam va katham akrita punyaha prabhavati, right? Which means Shiva becomes capable of creation only when united with Shakti. Without her, even the great Lord is not able to stir, right? You are indeed worthy of worship even by Hari, Vishnu, Hara or Shiva, and Birinchi, which is a very interesting name, which is Lord Brahma's name, which people don't talk about all that much. How then can someone of little merit hope to praise or even bow to you? Right? So this idea of this duality working together, and without that, even Mahadev, right, Lord Shiva, cannot possibly do the various things in many different ways, right, is the first shloka of the Saundarya Lahiri, right? So you can see the importance it is being given. I mean, in Trika Shaivism, in Shakta worship, in various strands, Devi Mahatmayam, right, for instance. So you see this coming through in those areas. Now, you also have something called simultaneity, simultaneous things, right? So for instance, I could say that I love that person and I'm very frustrated with them, right? People often say that, right, at the same time, right? In this certain job, for instance, I'm finding a lot of fulfillment, but I'm also deeply kind of antagonized by XYZ things, right? It's not that it's exhaustive or exclusive from each other. They are coming together in a simultaneous manner to give us the complete picture of what you think of it, right? So if you take one in its absolute sense, right, it doesn't quite characterize what you are meaning of it, essentially, right?
And both so at the same time, absolutely, you're thinking the same thing, that right, it's healthy.
Right. And your mind does think of a number of different things together, right? It's not usually isolated aspects which are, you know, posited or processed in that way, right? Now, when we talk about inhalation and exhalation, right, simple biological process, right, the duality between these two creates the rhythm of life. And we have seen that when we are doing vipassana, when we are doing meditation, when we are doing certain kinds of, you know, these mindful breathing exercises, there is an aspect of the pause in between the inhalation and exhalation, which is also called apnea, right? And that we have seen in various kinds of studies that pause is associated with enhanced interoceptive awareness, and the transient stabilization of these networks of attention, right? How attention comes into the picture. And neuroimaging has shown that these pauses engage what we call as a prefrontal cortex and the insula in our body. And that is what helps us in conscious awareness and self-monitoring, right? So functionally, this is what we call as a meta-stable state, right? It is neither stable nor unstable in its entirety. But these meta-stable or meta-stability is often important when we're talking about systems where there are two different binaries, let's say, right? Two different states, right? So when people say, yeah, stable hai ya unstable hai, I think the answer sometimes is in somewhere in the middle, right? And in this case also we see that that indeed is the case. Now modern physics, right? When we talk about modern physics, we have a number of different places where dualities have come in. We have, and they are complementary again. So for instance, electricity and magnetism we have spoken about. They are part of the same kind of electromagnetic force of sorts. Space and time is part of space-time now, for instance. Then you have matter and energy, the equivalence principle. But if we move a little forward, we have different formulations of the fundamental forces spoken of in terms of symmetry breaking, for instance, right? Or even the gauge symmetry, the idea of gauge symmetries or gauge fields, right? They give us a better understanding of how to describe these forces, and there is a certain degree of redundancy when we talk about gauge symmetries. In string theory, for instance, and various other theories, you have dualities like T-duality, which talks about whether there is a spatial dimension that is small or that is large, right? You talk about S-duality, which talks about how the systems couple with respect to each other, right? Do they couple very strongly or in a certain weaker way? Particles and antiparticles, right? We often talk about CPT symmetry and certain other kinds of symmetries, how these dualities are negotiated, how they are kind of mediated essentially. That is, these are all very integral parts of modern physics, as we call it, right? So there's a very interesting text, a work by Acharya Anandhdana, right? He is a 9th century Kashmiri theorist, and he gives us the theory of dhwani, right? Dhwani theory, which is a theory of poetic suggestion, essentially. And in the dhwani theory, he talks about certain aspects of rasa not being the content surface, but rather the suggested meaning that is present in the silences, in the pauses, right? For instance, he talks about separation, this element of separation, vipralambha shringara, which is basically the shringara or the rasa of love in separation, right? So in that, for instance, you have many kinds of unspoken suggestions, right? The sighs that you have on stage, right? The imagery of moonlight behind a person, an actor, for instance, the trembling voice. These are all parts of an experience, right? And the rasa is something both personal and impersonal, right? It is something where the audience feels the ache of that longing, right? And it's not the words, it's not just the words, because if it were just the words, that would be a very dry way to understand love and separation, right? It is about those interstices, those gaps between the words, right? And that is what makes this such a beautiful, suggestive resonance, right? We talk about resonance.
Difference between shallow and deep.
Right. And not only that, as I said, in art, when you're looking at some painting, for instance, it is all about, to use the physics word again, resonance, right? You resonate with something in that, right? And that is creating the most direct experience of non-duality. So there's a multiplicity of dualities there, right? But at the end of that, right?
It's beautiful.
It is beautiful, right? And that beauty is probably non-dual, right? And that is where we have to understand that there is no tension. There is no this or that, even in that space. It is just all about reconciling that and understanding in terms of realization, essentially.
That's wonderful, sir. Thank you very much. And I like to end it with one thing that I remember right now. One novel I read a long time ago of Bibhutishan Bandyopadhyay's Devyang.
Yes.
So I will not go into the details of that story. There is two hermits from the Dvaita philosophy, and one is Advaita school.
Yes.
And they were, discussing about their philosophies.
Right.
And the Advaitavadi is saying to the Dvaitavadi is saying to the Advaitavadi that you are niras. So you are out of rasa.
Right. So I mean, for instance, even in Thakur's case, Sri Ramakrishna Paramhamsa's case, his guru, Totapuri Maharaj, he was a through and through Advaitin, right? And there is a story, I mean, I think we had discussed in one of the previous interactions, where he is like, what is with this Devi worship that you do, right? Eta ki korcho tumi, what are you doing, right? So Sri Ramakrishna doesn't say much, right? But then there is this episode where Totapuri has a certain kind of bout of rashes or some kind of, affliction, physically speaking. And then Sri Ramakrishna says that, well, Devi is also a part of that non-duality you talk about, right? And my mode of relating to that, my mode of understanding, accessing that, right? And being one in that, essentially, is what I do. Right? So I don't see an irreconcilable difference. I don't see something which is at odds with each other, essentially.
Like how it will feel like if you see yourself in your lover.
Right, absolutely. So you, again, the idea of resonance, right? You see yourself in the other,
yes,
right? And that union creates the beauty, essentially.